She was standing in the rain, blood mixing with mud, when the wagon rolled up. He didn't ask if she needed help, just said, "They're looking for a mother." The words were rough, scraped raw by the wind that tore across the flats between High Gulch and the Gray Ridge. Calla didn't look up. She couldn't. The welt across her cheek was already swelling, pulling the skin so tight her eye was a slit of shimmering pain. Rain plastered her thin cotton dress to her ribs, each drop a cold reminder of the lash that had put her here, on her knees, in the God's-forsaken mud. The horse stamped a hoof, the creak of leather a sound from another world, a world where people still moved, still had purpose. Her purpose had been bled out of her on the packed dirt floor of the cabin she'd called home, each strike of Jedediah's belt a sermon on her failure. Barren, useless, a field that won't grow. The words were his, but they had taken root in her soul long ago. Now they were all that was left. The man in the wagon said nothing more. He just waited, the silence stretching, broken only by the drumming rain on the canvas cover and the sigh of his horse. Calla could feel his gaze on the crown of her head, where her hair was matted with mud, and something sticky warm she knew was her own blood. Shame was a living thing, a hot coal in her belly. It was one thing to be beaten. It was another to be seen, to be witnessed in your disgrace. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the rain would wash her away, dissolve her into the earth like a salt lick in a storm. But the ground held her fast. The wagon remained. Finally, a different sound, a soft thump. He'd tossed something. It landed in the mud near her hand. A thick wool blanket, smelling of damp wool and horses and something else. Smoke, maybe. It was an offering, not of pity, but of practicality, like tossing a rope to a drowning cow. Slowly her fingers uncurled from the fists she dug into the mud. They were stiff, caked, the nails broken. She reached for the blanket, the wool rough against her raw skin. It was heavy, substantial. She pulled it around her shoulders, the weight a strange comfort, a shield against the lashing wind. It was then she finally looked up. The man was a silhouette against the bruised purple sky, his hat brim low, shadowing a face carved from hard lines and patience. He wasn't young. Weather had worked him over, leaving its map in the creases around his eyes. He held the reins loosely in one hand. He wasn't looking at her face, but at the road ahead, as if her decision was already made, and he was just waiting for her to catch up to it. "They're good kids," he said, his voice still that same gravelly monotone. "Just a lot of them." Calla tried to speak, to ask a question, to say anything, but her throat was a knot of pain. A dry rasp was all that came out. She didn't know this man. She'd seen him in High Gulch once or twice, loading supplies. Vetch, his name was. Baron Vetch, a rancher from out near the Gray Ridge. A man whose wife had been taken by the fever 2 winters back. Everyone knew the story. 4 children left behind. 4. The word echoed in the empty, aching space inside her. Jedediah had wanted one, just one, and her failure had been a sin he'd punished daily. What use could she be to 4? She, who was broken, cursed. She clutched the blanket tighter. The alternative was to stay here, to wait for the cold to seep into her bones, or for Jedediah to come looking for her, his rage cooled enough to want his property back. The thought was a spur, sharper than any pain. She pushed herself up, her knees screaming in protest, her whole body a single, throbbing bruise. Mud sucked at her bare feet. She took a step, then another, each one a victory over the voice that whispered she was worth less than the ground she stood on. He didn't offer a hand to help her into the wagon. He just shifted over on the wooden seat, making room. The space felt enormous, a chasm of unspoken things. She climbed, her movements clumsy, her wet dress clinging and cold. The wagon smelled of hay and leather and children, a faint Swedish scent of milk, and the sharper tang of unwashed boys. She sat on the very edge of the seat, huddled in the blanket, a world away from the man beside her. He clucked to the horse, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting deep ruts in the muddy track. They didn't speak. High Gulch fell away behind them, its few lamp-lit windows swallowed by the rain. The world became the rhythmic splash of the horses' hooves, the groan of the wagon, and the steady, relentless drumming on the canvas. Calla stared out at the blur of the landscape, the skeletal shapes of sagebrush and twisted juniper. She wasn't going to a home. She was escaping a grave. And she was riding in a hearse driven by a stranger toward a life she couldn't begin to imagine. The only thing she knew for sure was that it couldn't be worse than the one she'd left behind. It couldn't. She repeated the words in her mind, a desperate prayer against the rising tide of fear. The Vetch Ranch was not a place of welcome. It was a place of necessity. The house was a stark, two-story box of unpainted timber, weathered to the color of old bone. The barn was larger, its double doors scarred by a black, jagged line, a lightning strike from some long-ago storm that had branded the wood forever. Fences sagged. A trough overflowed, creating a small pond in the muddy yard. Everything spoke of work undone, of a life too full of tasks and not enough hands. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the front door of the house flew open, and a boy, no older than 10, stood framed in the doorway. He held a lantern high, the light catching the worry in his young old face. "Pa, is that you?" "It's me, Eli," Baron Vetch said, his voice softening just a fraction. He climbed down, his boots sinking into the mud. "Get back inside. You'll catch your death." He didn't look at Calla, just started unhitching the horse, his movements economical and sure. She remained on the wagon seat, a statue wrapped in a borrowed blanket. The boy, Eli, didn't go inside. His eyes, wide and dark in the lantern light, were fixed on her. He saw the mud, the wet dress, the way she huddled into herself. He saw a wound. Another boy, younger, appeared behind him, peering around his brother's legs. Then a girl, her hair in two messy braids, her face a pale oval of curiosity. Finally, a tiny head, barely visible, clutching the girl's dress. 4. They were all there, a silent, staring jury. Calla's breath caught in her throat. They were so small, so terribly small to be without a mother. She saw the patches on Eli's trousers, the smudge of dirt on the girl's cheek. She saw the quiet hunger in their eyes, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the same hollow ache she felt in her own soul. Baron finished with the horse and finally turned to her. His gaze was direct, unreadable. "The kitchen's warm," he said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. He walked toward the house, and the children parted to let him pass, their eyes never leaving Calla. She knew this was it, the moment of choice. She could stay in the wagon, let him take her back to town in the morning, or she could slide off this seat, walk through that door, and face the 4 pairs of eyes that were already measuring her, judging her, wondering if she was the answer to a question they were too young to even know how to ask. Her body screamed with every bruise, every cut, but the cold was deeper. The loneliness was colder. She slid from the seat, her bare feet landing in the cold, soft mud. It squelched between her toes. She didn't wipe it away. She walked toward the light, one slow, painful step at a time. The kitchen was a chaos of warmth and clutter. A huge cast-iron stove dominated one wall, radiating a heat that made her skin prickle. A long wooden table stood in the center, scarred with knife marks and burns. On it sat 5 bowls. One was large, a man's bowl. 4 were smaller. They were empty. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on a cutting board, its edges ragged. Dirty dishes were piled in a basin. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, old coffee, and unwashed children. The 4 of them had followed her in, and now stood in a line by the door, a silent, watchful tribe. Eli, the oldest, had his arms crossed, his expression a careful mask of suspicion. The girl, who looked to be about 7, held the hand of the smallest, a little girl with wide, frightened eyes and a thumb stuck firmly in her mouth. The second boy, maybe 5 years old, hid behind his sister, peeking out at Calla. Baron Vetch ignored them all. He went to the stove, poured coffee from a blackened pot into a tin mug. He didn't offer her any. He leaned against the wall, sipping the coffee, his eyes finally meeting hers. That's Eli. That's Sarah. The boy is Luke, and the little one is Hannah. He recited the names like a list of inventory. Kids, this is Calla. He stumbled over her name, as if he'd only just remembered to ask it on the ride over. Or maybe he hadn't asked at all. Maybe it didn't matter. She was just the woman who was here to fill the empty space. Calla looked at the children, at their worn clothes and solemn faces. She saw their mother's absence in every corner of the room, in the dust on the shelves, in the way they huddled together for safety. She saw herself in their loneliness. She pulled the blanket tighter, a fragile shield. Her gaze fell on a rocking chair in the corner, near the stove. It was a simple thing, wood-worn smooth with use. But the back was cracked, a jagged fissure running down the central slat. It had been broken, and no one had bothered to fix it, just like everything else. "There's water heating on the stove," Barron said, gesturing with his mug. "There's a room upstairs, first on the left." He drained his coffee and set the mug down with a clatter. "I've got chores." And with that, he was gone, out the back door and into the rain-swept darkness, leaving her alone with his children and the wreckage of their lives. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Calla stood dripping on the floorboards, the children staring, the house groaning around them. The little one, Hannah, took her thumb out of her mouth. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice a tiny whisper. Calla instinctively touched her cheek, her fingers coming away smeared with red. The sight of it, stark and real in the lamplight, broke something open inside her. She wasn't just a barren wife. She wasn't just a beaten woman. She was a person, bleeding in a stranger's kitchen, in front of 4 motherless children. Sarah, the older girl, took a hesitant step forward. She pointed to a small door under the stairs. "Mama's things are in there," she said, her voice soft. "There's soap and a dress." The room was small, more of a closet, filled with the ghost of another woman. A simple calico dress hung from a peg, smelling faintly of lavender and wood smoke. A small box on a shelf held a brush, a few hairpins, and a bar of lye soap. Calla touched the dress. It was worn, but clean and carefully mended. She saw the tiny, neat stitches along a seam, a testament to a woman's care. A wave of something sharp and painful washed over her, the shame of the interloper. This was not her place. These were not her things. But the cold of her wet dress was a more immediate misery. She took the dress and the soap and went upstairs. The room was as stark as the rest of the house. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small table with a wash basin and a pitcher. A single window looked out over the dark, sodden yard. She poured the hot water from the kettle Barron had mentioned into the basin. The steam rose, carrying the metallic scent of the iron. She washed the blood and mud from her face and hands, the lye soap stinging in the cuts. The water in the basin turned a murky pink. She looked at her reflection, a stranger with a swollen face and haunted eyes. She was a stray dog, taken in for a purpose. She was here to be a mother, but she didn't know the first thing about mothering. She only knew the pain of not being one. When she came back down, wearing the borrowed dress, the children were still at the table. They hadn't moved. Eli had taken the loaf of bread and was methodically cutting it into thick, clumsy slices. He didn't look at her. Sarah was trying to coax Hannah into eating a piece, but the little girl just shook her head, her eyes still fixed on Calla. Luke, the younger boy, was tracing patterns in the dust on the table. The 5 empty bowls seemed to mock her. Calla walked to the stove. It was a beast, but she knew stoves. Jedediah's cabin had been small, but the stove had been her domain. She found a sack of potatoes and some onions in a bin. There was salt pork hanging from a hook. It wasn't much, but it was something. Without a word, she began to work. She washed the potatoes, her hands moving with a sureness that surprised her. She sliced the onions, the sharp smell making her eyes water, a welcome, ordinary pain. She diced the pork and threw it into a heavy skillet, the sizzle and pop filling the quiet kitchen. The children watched her every move. They watched as she found flour and made a thick gravy. They watched as she mashed the potatoes, adding a splash of milk she found in a pail on the back porch. The smells began to change. The scent of frying pork and onions, of hot gravy and warm bread, began to chase away the stale air of neglect. It was the smell of a meal, a real meal. When it was ready, she didn't know what to do. She stood by the stove, a spoon in her hand, suddenly shy. It was Eli who broke the spell. He pushed his empty bowl across the table toward her, a silent request. Calla hesitated for only a second. Then she walked to the table and filled his bowl, then Sarah's, then Luke's. She put a small portion in Hannah's bowl, though the child still hadn't moved. She filled the last small bowl and pushed it to the empty space where she assumed she was supposed to sit. She didn't fill the large bowl. That was his. She sat, her back to the cracked rocking chair. The children stared at their full bowls as if they were a miracle. Luke picked up a piece of potato with his fingers and shoved it in his mouth. Sarah shot him a disapproving look, then picked up her own fork. Eli ate with a grim determination, his eyes on his plate. Calla watched them, a strange tightness in her chest. She hadn't eaten all day, but she wasn't hungry. She was just watching. Hannah finally looked down at her bowl. She poked a piece of potato with her finger. Then she looked up at Calla, her big dark eyes full of a question Calla couldn't answer. The back door opened, and Baron Vetch filled the doorway, bringing the cold night air with him. He stopped, his gaze taking in the scene. The table, the children eating, Calla sitting in the chair that had been his wife's. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He walked to the stove, picked up the skillet, and scraped the remaining food into his own bowl without a word. He didn't sit at the table. He ate standing by the counter, his back to them all. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on ceramic and the steady, mournful sigh of the wind outside. Calla looked at the 4 children, then at the man with his back to his family. This wasn't a home. It was a collection of lonely people in a house, and she was the loneliest of them all. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of work and silence. Calla rose before the sun, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet. She would light the stove, the flare of the match a small rebellion against the darkness. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She learned the geography of the house, the loose floorboard on the landing, the window in the pantry that wouldn't shut tight, letting in a constant, whispering draft. She learned the children. Eli was proud and watchful, his father's son. He did his chores with a fierce competence, as if trying to hold his broken family together with the sheer force of his will. He rarely spoke to Calla, but she would find a bucket of fresh water by the stove in the morning, or a pile of kindling stacked neatly in the wood box. Silent offerings. Sarah was the little mother, her face a constant mask of worry. She tried to manage her younger siblings, her voice a high-pitched imitation of a grown woman's. She would watch Calla work, her eyes taking in every detail, as if trying to learn the secret language of housekeeping, the spells and potions that turned a house into a home. Luke was a whirlwind of untamed energy, a creature of dirt and noise and scraped knees. He was the first to forget she was a stranger. He would burst into the kitchen, shouting about a frog he'd found, or a hawk he'd seen, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. And Hannah. Hannah was a ghost. She trailed behind Sarah, a silent, watchful shadow. She never spoke to Calla. She would sit in a corner, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes following Calla's every move. She was a small, wounded bird, and Calla had no idea how to mend her wing. And Baron. Baron was a presence, a force of nature like the wind and the rain. He was gone before dawn and returned after dusk, his body weary, his face etched with the hardships of the land. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. The fence on the north pasture is down. We're low on flour. There's a storm coming. He never thanked her. He never acknowledged the clean floors or the mended clothes or the hot meals waiting on the table. But every evening, he would eat the food she cooked. He would sit at the head of the table now, a silent king in his lonely kingdom, and he would eat. Calla learned not to expect more. She poured her energy into the work, into the relentless rhythm of chores. It was a way to keep the memories at bay, the ghost of Jedediah's voice, the sting of his hand. Here her worth was measured in loaves of bread and clean shirts. It was a hard measure, but it was an honest one. It didn't heal the wound inside her, the deep aching barrenness of her body, but it covered it, like a clean bandage over a festering sore. One afternoon, a week after she arrived, the sky turned a sickly yellow-green. The air grew still and heavy. Barron, who had been mending a harness in the barn, came to the kitchen door. "Get the children inside," he said, his voice tight, "and bolt the shutters." Calla didn't question him. She'd seen skies like this before. She gathered the children, her voice calm but firm. Luke wanted to stay outside and watch, but Eli, his face pale, grabbed his arm and pulled him in. Sarah herded Hannah into the corner, away from the windows. Calla moved through the house, securing the heavy wooden shutters, plunging the rooms into a premature twilight. The first blast of wind hit the house like a fist, rattling the windows in their frames. The rain came a moment later, not in drops, but in solid sheets, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sound. The house groaned, the timbers creaking under the assault. Hannah began to cry, a thin, terrified wail. Sarah tried to comfort her, but the little girl was inconsolable, her small body shaking with fear. Calla went to them. She knelt down, ignoring the protest of her still healing bruises. She didn't try to shush Hannah, she just started to sing. It was a song her own mother had sung to her, a simple, quiet lullaby about a riverboat and a silver moon. Her voice was rusty at first, thin and uncertain, but she kept on, the melody a fragile thread in the tapestry of the storm's fury. Luke stopped fidgeting. Eli, who had been staring at the rattling door, turned to look at her. Sarah's tense shoulders relaxed, and Hannah's sobs slowly subsided into hiccuping breaths. She was still crying, but now she was listening. Calla kept singing, her eyes on the child's face. She sang of quiet water and gentle breezes, of a safe harbor at the end of the day. She sang until the storm outside seemed to lose some of its rage, its roar becoming a distant, angry rumble. She sang until Hannah's eyes drifted shut, her small head slumping against Sarah's shoulder. When the song was over, the kitchen was quiet, save for the drumming of the rain. Calla looked up and saw Barron standing in the doorway to the barn, dripping wet, his face unreadable in the dim light. He had been there the whole time. He had listened. He didn't say anything. He just turned and went back out into the storm. But later that night, after the children were asleep, Calla came downstairs to find him sitting at the table, working a piece of wood with a small knife. He was carving. She watched from the shadows of the staircase as he carefully shaped the wood, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He was making a bird, a small, simple bird with outstretched wings. The next morning, the carved bird was sitting on the windowsill above the sink. It was unpainted, unadorned, but it was perfect. It was a silent acknowledgement, a thank you, spoken in the only language he knew. The cracked rocking chair became her place. In the evenings, after the dishes were done and the children were in bed, she would sit by the fire, a basket of mending in her lap. The chair complained with every rock, a low groan that echoed the ache in her own bones. But the rhythm was soothing. Rock, stitch, rock, stitch. It was a prayer of sorts, a prayer for peace. One night, she found a pile of old scraps in the closet where she'd found the dress. Bits of calico, worn flannel, a piece of a man's blue work shirt. They were the remnants of the family's life before her, the ghost of the woman who had sat in this chair before her. On impulse, she took them out and began to piece them together. She didn't have a pattern. She just laid the pieces out on the floor, arranging them by instinct. A patch of faded floral print next to a square of sturdy blue denim. A bit of soft, worn gingham beside a strip of rough sackcloth. It was a mosaic of their lives, of hardship and small beauties. She began to stitch them together, her needle flying, her mind quiet for the first time in years. She was not making a quilt for warmth. She was stitching together the broken pieces of a life. Her life, their life. A new thing, made from the scraps of the old. The shawl grew slowly, night by night. It became a map of her time at the ranch, a patch from the dress Sarah had outgrown, a piece from the shirt Luke had ripped while climbing a tree, a scrap of the blanket Barron had tossed to her in the mud. Each stitch was a word in a story she was just beginning to understand. The children noticed. Luke would come and lean against her knee, tracing the patterns with a grubby finger. "That was my shirt," he'd say, a note of pride in his voice. Sarah would watch her, her eyes soft. "It's pretty," she'd whisper. Even Eli, the stoic, watchful Eli, would sometimes glance over from his book, his gaze lingering on the growing patchwork of colors. Only Hannah remained distant, a small, silent observer from the shadows. One evening, as Calla sat rocking and stitching, Barron came in from the barn. He didn't just pass through as he usually did. He stopped by the fireplace, ostensibly to warm his hands, but his eyes were on the shawl in her lap. "That was Mary's," he said, his voice low. He touched a small square of lavender-sprigged cotton. Her favorite dress. Calla's hands stilled. The needle pricked her finger. A tiny bead of blood welled up. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can take it out." He shook his head, his gaze distant. "No," he said. "It belongs there." He looked at the shawl, at the jumble of colors and textures, at the way she was joining the disparate pieces into a whole. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond exhaustion and grief. She saw a flicker of understanding. He was a man who knew about broken things. His barn door wore the scar of lightning. His rocking chair was cracked. His family was shattered. He understood the need to piece things back together, to make something new and strong from the wreckage. He didn't say another word. He just stood by the fire for a long moment, then turned and went upstairs. But the silence he left behind was different. It was not empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken truth. The first snow came early that year, a thick, silent blanket that transformed the harsh landscape into something soft and beautiful. The world shrank to the boundaries of the ranch, to the warmth of the house and the steam rising from the barn. The isolation should have been terrifying, but Calla found a strange peace in it. The work was endless, shoveling paths, melting snow for water, keeping the fires fed. But it was a shared work. Eli worked alongside his father, his young shoulders squared with responsibility. Calla and Sarah worked in the house, the rhythm of their tasks a comfortable dance. Luke and Hannah built a lopsided snowman in the yard, their laughter bright against the white silence. In the evenings, the family gathered in the kitchen, the only truly warm room in the house. Barron would read from a worn copy of Shakespeare, his voice a low rumble, the ancient words filling the small space with tragedy and poetry. Eli would listen intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah would draw, her tongue stuck out in concentration. Luke would fall asleep on the rug by the fire, and Calla would rock and stitch, the patchwork shawl growing, becoming a part of the fabric of their lives. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Hannah woke up screaming. Calla was there in an instant, her heart pounding. The little girl was sitting bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the storm. "The dark," she whimpered. "It's coming." Calla sat on the edge of the bed and gathered the trembling child into her arms. Hannah was stiff at first, resistant, but Calla held on, rocking her gently, humming the riverboat lullaby. "It's just the wind, little one," she whispered. "It can't get in." But Hannah shook her head, her small hands clutching Calla's dress. "Not the wind," she sobbed. "The dark that took Mama." Calla's breath caught. She looked over at Sarah asleep in the other bed, and at Baron, who was now standing in the doorway, his face a mask of anguish. This was a grief she couldn't heal, a wound she couldn't stitch. All she could do was hold on. She held Hannah tight, letting the child's tears soak the front of her nightdress. She rocked her and hummed, her own heart aching with a sorrow so profound it felt like her own. She wasn't just holding a frightened child, she was holding the collected pain of this broken family. She stayed until Hannah's sobs subsided, until her breathing evened out into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. She gently laid her back on the pillow and tucked the blankets around her. When she turned, Baron was still there. He looked at her, his eyes glistening in the lamplight. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In the shared space of that terrible, sacred moment, something shifted between them. A wall crumbled. A door creaked open. The next day, Baron didn't go to the barn right after breakfast. He stayed in the kitchen, watching as Calla braided Sarah's hair. He cleared his throat. "The stove in the parlor is broken," he said. "The flue is blocked. I can't seem to reach it." It was a statement of fact, but it was also a question, an admission of defeat. Calla finished Sarah's braid and tied it with a bit of string. "I have small hands," she said simply. She followed him into the parlor, a room they never used. It was cold and smelled of dust and disuse. A sheet covered a horsehair sofa. The stove was an ornate cast-iron thing, cold and silent. She took off the grate and peered up the flue. It was dark and narrow. She wrapped a cloth around her hand and arm and reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something soft and brittle. She pulled, and a mass of dried leaves and twigs came tumbling out, followed by the perfectly preserved body of a dead sparrow. It had built its nest in the wrong place and paid the ultimate price. Calla looked at the tiny, still creature in her hand, its feathers still soft. She felt a pang of kinship. She, too, had tried to build a nest in the wrong place. She cleared the rest of the blockage, and soon a cheerful fire was crackling in the grate, chasing the chill from the long-neglected room. That evening, after the children were asleep, Baron came to her as she sat in her rocking chair, stitching her shawl. He didn't say anything. He just knelt and took the chair in his big hands. He examined the crack in the back, running his thumb along the splintered wood. He went to his toolbox and came back with wood glue and clamps. He worked carefully, methodically, cleaning the edges of the break, applying the glue, and tightening the clamps until the two pieces of wood were pressed together as one. He didn't look at her as he worked, but his hands, which could break a horse or mend a fence, were gentle. He was fixing the chair. He was fixing something that was broken. When he was done, he stood up and looked at his handiwork. "It should hold," he said. It was the closest he had ever come to saying her name. The thaw came, and with it, a sense of new beginnings. The world dripped and sighed, the snow receding to reveal the muddy, sleeping earth. The children, freed from the confines of the house, exploded into the yard, their shouts and laughter a welcome sound. Calla found herself smiling, a real, unforced smile that reached her eyes. She had survived the winter. She had survived the storm. She was still here. She finished the shawl. It was a riot of color and texture, a testament to resilience. It was heavy and warm, and when she wrapped it around her shoulders, she felt whole. She felt as if she were wearing the story of her own salvation. One afternoon, she was hanging laundry on the line, the clean sheets snapping in the spring breeze, when she saw a rider approaching. He was still a long way off, a dark speck against the greening hills. But there was something about the way he sat his horse, a familiar, arrogant slump, that made her blood run cold. She knew who it was before he was close enough to see his face. Jedediah. Her hands froze on the clothesline. The clothespins fell from her numb fingers. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile peace she had built. He had found her. He had come to take her back. She stood paralyzed, the wind whipping her hair across her face, her heart hammering against her ribs. The children were playing near the barn, their laughter suddenly a sound of unbearable fragility. She had to get them inside. She had to protect them. The thought broke the spell. She ran, her feet flying over the muddy ground. "Eli! Sarah! Get the little ones inside! Now!" The children, startled by the terror in her voice, obeyed without question. They scrambled into the barn, pulling the heavy, lightning-scarred doors shut behind them. Calla didn't follow. She turned and stood in the middle of the yard, her feet planted, the patchwork shawl clutched around her shoulders like armor. She would not hide. She would not run. Not this time. Jedediah rode into the yard and reined in his horse, his lip curling in a sneer as he took in the scene. He looked thinner, meaner. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her, noting the clean dress, the healthy color in her cheeks. "Well, well," he said, his voice a greasy drawl. "Look what the cat dragged in. Playing house, are we? With the widower and his litter." He spat on the ground. "Get your things. You're coming home." "This is my home," Calla said, her voice shaking but clear. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. This pigsty? You belong to me. The preacher said so. Now stop this foolishness and get on the horse." He started to dismount, and a primal fear seized her. She saw the belt, she felt the sting of the lash, but then she heard a small sound from the barn. A whimper. Hannah. The sound was a steel rod in her spine. She took a step forward, placing her body between Jedediah and the barn door. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You will not touch them. You will not come near them." Jedediah's face darkened with rage. "They ain't your brats to protect. You're a barren woman, a useless piece of property, my property, and I've come to collect." He took a step toward her, his hand raised. Calla flinched, but she did not retreat. She stood her ground, her eyes blazing. "You can beat me," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You can kill me, but you will not pass." At that moment, the barn door creaked open. Baron Vetch stepped out, a pitchfork in his hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence a silent, immovable wall. Eli was behind him, holding a rusty axe. Even Sarah stood in the doorway, her small face set, her hands clenched into fists. They were a family, a strange, broken patchwork family. And they were hers. Jedediah saw them. He saw Baron's quiet menace, the fierce protectiveness in the children's eyes. He saw Calla, transformed from a cowering wife into a lioness defending her cubs. He hesitated, his bluster failing him. He was a bully, and bullies only fight when they know they can win. He looked from Baron's stony face to Calla's defiant one. He cursed, a vile stream of filth. He remounted his horse, his movements jerky and angry. "You'll regret this," he snarled at Calla. "You'll come crawling back. There's nothing for you here." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, a dark, bitter stain on the landscape. Calla stood watching until he was gone, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The strength drained out of her, leaving her weak and shaky. Baron walked to her side. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a comfort, a shield. The children came out of the barn and gathered around her, their small hands reaching for her, touching her dress, her shawl, as if to reassure themselves that she was real, that she was still there. She had done it. She had faced her demon and she had not broken. She had protected them. She had chosen them. And in doing so, she had chosen herself. That night, at the dinner table, the 5 bowls were full. The silence was different. It was not the silence of loneliness or grief. It was the silence of peace, of a battle won. Baron looked at her across the table, his eyes holding a new warmth, a deep respect. Eli, for the first time, gave her a small, shy smile. Sarah reached out and patted her hand. Luke told her a long, rambling story about a frog, and she listened to every word. Hannah, who had been quiet through the meal, suddenly looked up at Calla, her eyes wide and serious. She pointed a small, sticky finger at her. The youngest called her Ma, but it was her who cried first.